There's a point within you that has never been wounded, a core of silence that impassively observes all the storms of your life, your pains, your joys, your failures, and your masks. The mystics called it the divine spark. Depth psychology named it the self. This is not the I that you know, the ego that fights daily for recognition and control. It is the greater I, the silent totality that dreams your entire life. The most curious part? It communicates with you constantly, not through logical thoughts, but through symbols, synchronicities, and, above all, through what you most fear and reject in yourself, your own shadow. What you believe to be your greatest flaw, your most shameful failure, is, in fact, a ciphered map, a direct invitation from the self to your own healing and wholeness. The journey to decipher this code is the only one that truly matters. What we will do here in the next few minutes is not a lecture. It is a psychic operation, a symbolic vivisection. If you are afraid to look within, this video is not for you. Close it now. But if a part of you, the part that is exhausted from living a fragmented life, feels a resonance with these words, then you are home. For this journey to be complete, I need 3 things from you. First, your subscription, not as a number, but as a pact, a commitment that you are ready to stop seeking answers outside and start mapping your inner universe. Second, your like. Think of it as a beacon of light, an affirmation to the algorithm that this kind of deep searching is necessary in such a superficial world. And third, and most importantly, a comment. Leave the question that most haunts your nights, the doubt you don't have the courage to ask anyone. This space will be our anonymous consultation room, our temple of reflection. Do it now, before we dive in, to seal your intention. Ready? Then take a deep breath. The descent is about to begin. The journey toward the self rarely begins with a conscious choice. It starts with a disturbance, a collapse. It is the promising career that suddenly loses its meaning, the perfect relationship that reveals itself to be a stage for projections, or a deep depression that emerges without an apparent cause, like a mist rising from the soil of the soul. This is the call. The self, the archetype of totality, does not negotiate with the ego on friendly terms. It acts like nature itself, through earthquakes, droughts, and psychic floods. The ego, our center of consciousness, has built a small fortified kingdom with rigid laws about what is acceptable, good, and safe. We live within these walls, believing they are the entirety of the world, while the vastness of the unconscious 99% of our psychic territory remains unexplored. The call is the sound of this little kingdom's structure beginning to crack. It is the pain of one-sidedness. When we live only from logic, emotion becomes a monster. When we identify only with our goodness, our capacity for cruelty accumulates in the shadow, waiting to erupt. Neurosis, in this sense, is not a disease to be cured, but a sign of health. It is a cry for help from the soul, a compassionate reminder that we are living a life that is too small, disconnected from our totality. The ego, in its panic, tries to reinforce the walls, more work, more distractions, more control. But the call of the self is like the force of gravity. It can be resisted for a time, but its pull is ultimately inescapable. The first task of the individual seeking individuation is not to act, but to listen. It is to sit amidst the ruins of their certainties and ask, what in me is trying to be born from this destruction? It is to recognize that the symptom that torments them is not the enemy, but a messenger from the depths, carrying an invitation to a journey that the ego fears, but the soul craves. The acceptance of this call is the true beginning of the alchemical great work, the transformation of the sterile suffering of the symptom into the raw material, for the creation of a broader, more integrated consciousness. It is the moment when the question changes from why is this happening to me, to what does this want from me? Before we can find the true center, we need to understand the false thrones. The first and most obvious is the ego, the I with which we navigate the world. It is the manager of our conscious life, the hero of our personal story. However, its perspective is inherently limited, like a king who rules his small island and is unaware of the existence of entire continents. To relate to the external world, the ego develops a crucial adaptation tool, the persona. The persona is our wardrobe of social masks. We have a mask for work, another for family, another for friends. They are essential for social life, But the psychological tragedy occurs when we completely identify with the mask. This is what Jung called persona inflation, the professor who is only a professor, the doctor who is only a doctor, 24 hours a day. The person becomes two-dimensional, a caricature of themselves and their inner life, with all its contradictions and richness, atrophies. The clearest sign of this identification is chronic exhaustion and a persistent feeling of falseness. But there is an even more treacherous consequence: projection. Everything that does not fit our idealized persona, everything we consider inferior, immoral, or weak, is expelled from our conscious realm and thrown into the basement of the psyche, forming the shadow. Since the mind does not tolerate a vacuum, we project these unwanted qualities onto others. The authoritarian boss, the lazy neighbor, the corrupt politician, they become blank canvases where we paint the portraits of our own unrecognized shadow. The intensity of our emotional reaction to a trait in another person is a precise barometer of how much that same trait lives unresolved within us. The work of individuation therefore requires a painful but liberating withdrawal of projections. It consists of stopping pointing the finger at the world and starting to use a mirror. Every person who irritates, fascinates, or intensely repels us is a mirror reflecting a part of our own unknown totality. Recognizing this is an act of profound humility and the beginning of true psychological responsibility. It is to stop being a victim of circumstances and become a student of the mysteries that the outer world reveals about our vast and unknown inner world. No journey of individuation is authentic without the descent into the underworld. Without a face-to-face encounter with the shadow, Western culture, with its emphasis on light, positivity, and perfection, has taught us to fear, deny, and repress our darkness. The shadow has become synonymous with evil. But in depth psychology, the shadow is simply the other side, our unlived self. It contains not only our most destructive and primitive tendencies, our anger, envy, lust, but also a vast range of positive potentialities that were suppressed for being inconvenient for our ego or for social expectations. Repressed creativity, assertiveness that was called aggression in childhood, vulnerability that was seen as weakness. All of this is gold buried in the sludge of the shadow. The encounter with the shadow usually happens involuntarily. It erupts in moments of crisis, in Freudian slips, in disproportionate emotional outbursts, or in terrifying dreams. The more repressed it is, the more autonomous and dangerous it becomes. The nice individual, who never gets angry, is often the one who, under pressure, commits shocking acts of cruelty, to the surprise of everyone, including themselves. Integrating the shadow does not mean acting on these impulses. It is not about becoming a bad person, but about becoming a whole person. Integration is a process of awareness. It begins by admitting the existence of these qualities within us. It is the exercise of saying, yes, within me exists the capacity for cruelty, for betrayal, for hatred. This recognition does not make us evil. It makes us human and, paradoxically, gives us the power to choose not to act from these impulses. By bringing the shadow into the light of consciousness, we strip it of its autonomous and compulsive power. The monster that once controlled us from the shadows becomes a source of energy and vitality. Repressed anger, when integrated, transforms into assertiveness and the ability to set healthy boundaries. Denied sadness becomes a source of empathy and depth. This is the hardest work, as it requires us to abandon our idealized self-image and embrace the totality of who we are. It is a humbling process, but one that returns to us the weight, substance, and three-dimensionality we lost while trying to live only in the light. As the alchemical proverb says, in stercor invenitur, it is in the filth that the treasure is found. Once the work with the personal shadow deepens, the traveler of individuation encounters a new layer of the unconscious, this time of a collective nature. They encounter the archetypal figures of the anima, the inner image of the feminine, in a man's psyche, and the animus, the inner image of the masculine, in a woman's psyche. These figures are not personal. They are the personification of centuries of human experience with the opposite sex, a psychic precipitate that we all carry. The anima in a man manifests as his moods, his feelings, his capacity for relationship, and his connection to the irrational and the spiritual. A man disconnected from his anima tends to be rigid, dogmatic, emotionally arid, and secretly sentimental. He projects his anima onto real women, falling in love not with the woman herself, but with the carrier of his lost soul. This leads to relationships of dependency, idealization, and eventual disillusionment, as no real woman can bear the weight of a man's projected divinity. The animus in a woman, in turn, manifests as her opinions, her beliefs, her capacity for logic, and her connection to power and action. A woman unconscious of her animus is often possessed by it, becoming opinionated, argumentative, and trapped in rigid, unquestionable beliefs that are not truly hers, but the archetypes. She projects her animus onto men, seeking a hero or an authority to complete her, or, conversely, entering into fruitless power competitions. The integration of these figures is what Jung called the inner sacred marriage, or conjunctio. For the man, it means withdrawing the anima projections from external women and beginning to relate to his own inner world of feelings and emotions. It is learning to be vulnerable, to nurture his own soul. For the woman, it means withdrawing the animus projections and developing her own voice, her own authority, and her own power of discernment. It is learning to think for herself, from her own center. When a man integrates his anima, he does not become effeminate. He becomes profoundly creative and capable of a true relationship. When a woman integrates her animus, she does not become masculinized. She becomes wise, courageous, and the master of her own destiny. This inner marriage is the key to psychological maturity and to healthy relationships, where do whole people meet, rather than to needy halves trying to complete each other. As the psyche progresses on the journey of integration, a symbol begins to emerge spontaneously in dreams, fantasies, and even in absent-minded scribbles, the mandala, the Sanskrit word for circle. The mandala is one of humanity's oldest and most universal archetypes. It is the symbolic representation of the self, the ordering center of the psyche. Its structure is circle, a symbol of totality and eternity, with a well-defined center as a map of the soul in its state of harmony and integration. Jung observed that his patients, in moments of great crisis or therapeutic breakthrough, would begin to draw or dream of mandalas without any prior knowledge of them. It was as if the psyche itself, in its search for balance, spontaneously generated the image of its own healing. The mandala acts as an atom of the psyche, a nucleus around which the fragmented parts of the personality can begin to reorganize. The outer circle of the mandala represents the boundary between the conscious and unconscious worlds, a sacred and protective space where the work of integration can occur. The center of the mandala is the self, the point of origin and return. The shapes and patterns within the circle, often with a quaternary structure for corners, for colors, symbolize the union of opposites, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, matter and spirit. Creating or contemplating a mandala is a powerful exercise in active meditation. It is an act of imposing a symbolic order on our inner chaos. By focusing on its center, we are, symbolically, aligning ourselves with our own psychic center. The process of drawing a mandala, starting from the center to the periphery and returning, mirrors the very rhythm of life and the process of individuation, the expansion of consciousness into the world, and the necessary return to the center for integration. This symbol is not just a beautiful image, it is a psychic technology. It reminds us that even in the deepest disorientation, there is an ordering principle within us. It is the visual promise that wholeness is not only possible, but is the natural state toward which our soul strives. The appearance of a mandala in our lives is an auspicious sign, a milestone on the journey, indicating that after the chaos of the ego's deconstruction, a new, truer, and more comprehensive center is beginning to form. As the individual aligns more with the self and less with the ego, a fascinating phenomenon begins to occur with greater frequency, synchronicity. Jung coined this term to describe meaningful coincidences, events that are connected not by a cause and effect relationship, but by a bond of meaning. It is thinking of a friend you haven't seen in years, and 5 minutes later, they call you. It is struggling with a specific question, and suddenly, a book falls from a shelf, open to the page that contains the answer. The ego, with its mechanistic worldview, dismisses these events as mere chance, but for the psyche that is becoming aware of its connection to the collective unconscious, synchronicity is the language of the self. It is a wink from the universe, a sign that we are on the right path. Synchronicity operates on the principle that the inner world psyche and the outer world matter are not fundamentally separate, but are two aspects of the same unified reality. The unused mundus of the alchemists, when an archetype is constellated in the unconscious, that is, when a significant psychic energy is activated within us, it can manifest simultaneously in the external world. Synchronicity, therefore, is not something we make happen. It is a phenomenon we witness when we achieve a certain level of inner alignment. It is a byproduct of the individuation journey. The more we live from our center, the self, the more the outer world seems to conspire to guide, confirm, and teach us. To cultivate the ability to perceive synchronicity, one must develop an attitude of symbolic attention. It is learning to look at life's events not just literally, but metaphorically, asking, what is the meaning of this event for my inner journey? It is a continuous dialogue between the soul and the world. Synchronicity pulls us out of the alienation of feeling like an isolated consciousness in an indifferent universe and returns us to an enchanted world, a living and intelligent cosmos that actively participates in our growth process. It is the empirical proof that we are not alone and that the journey, however lonely it may seem, is guided by an invisible and meaningful order. Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, the most direct gateway to the wisdom of the self. At night, when the ego's control is relaxed, the deep psyche has the opportunity to express itself in its native language, the language of symbols and metaphors. For Jungian psychology, dreams are not mere residues of daily life or repressed wishes, but rather compensatory messages. They seek to balance the one-sided attitude of consciousness. If the ego is excessively rational, dreams will bring emotional and irrational content. If the persona is that of a docile and submissive person, dreams may bring images of power and aggression. The dream is always on the side of wholeness, trying to show us what we are neglecting. To decipher these nightly letters, one must abandon literal interpretation. The language of the dream is dramatic and symbolic. Every character, object, or setting in a dream represents a part of the dreamer's psyche. Dreaming of being chased by a frightening figure rarely refers to an external threat. More often, the figure is a personification of a part of the dreamer's own shadow, something they fear and are running from in their conscious life. Working with dreams involves a process of active imagination, a dialogue with these figures. It is asking the pursuer in the dream, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The answer, often surprising, can reveal an energy or potential that has been repressed and now seeks integration. The self often appears in dreams as symbols of wholeness, mandalas, circles, figures of wise authority, a wise old man or woman, or, paradoxically, as a divine child symbolizing the new potential, the reborn being that emerges from individuation. Writing down dreams and working with them is like learning a new language. It requires patience and humility, but it gradually reveals the map of our inner journey. Dreams show us where we are, where we need to go, and what inner resources we have at our disposal. To ignore dreams is to ignore the letters from a wise guide who is desperately trying to help us navigate an unknown and dangerous territory. They are the most reliable compass we possess on the long and winding journey back to the center. The journey of individuation is not an idyllic stroll. It is a crossing through dangerous territories, full of subtle traps. Two of the most treacherous are ego inflation and spiritual alienation. Inflation occurs when the ego, instead of humbly relating to the contents of the unconscious, tries to appropriate them. The individual begins to have glimpses of the vastness of the self, to touch powerful archetypal energies, and the small ego, instead of bowing to this greater force, identifies with it. They begin to feel special, enlightened, a chosen one. It is the birth of the phony guru, the person who uses spiritual knowledge not to serve wholeness, but to inflate their own sense of importance. This inflation is a form of defense. The ego, terrified by the prospect of its own dissolution before the self, tries to co-opt the numinous energy for its own purposes. The result is an arrogant, Dogmatic personality disconnected from common humanity. The inflated individual knows everything, but cannot maintain a healthy relationship or deal with the trivialities of daily life. It is a subtle and dangerous form of madness, where the person becomes a puppet of the wise old man or hero archetype, losing their humanity in the process. Alienation, on the other hand, is the opposite danger. It happens when the confrontation with the unconscious is so overwhelming that the ego shatters or withdraws completely. The individual is flooded with archetypal content without having a strong enough ego structure to integrate it. This can lead to psychotic episodes or a state of apathy and depersonalization. The person feels alienated from themselves and the world, lost in a sea of symbols they cannot comprehend. The key to avoiding these abysses is a strong and flexible ego, strong enough not to dissolve in the confrontation with the unconscious, and flexible enough to bow to the higher authority of the self. Individuation is not the destruction of the ego, but its relativization. The ego ceases to be the absolute monarch and becomes a loyal prime minister, serving the totality, the self. The antidote to inflation is humility, mundane work, humor, and connection with the community. It is remembering that despite all the transcendent experiences, we still have to wash the dishes and pay the taxes. Keeping one's feet firmly planted on the ground is the only safe way to explore the heavens of the psyche. It is crucial to understand that individuation is not a destination to be reached, but a lifelong process. There is no final moment of enlightenment after which all problems disappear. The goal is not perfection, but wholeness, and wholeness necessarily includes imperfection, conflict, and pain. The self is not a static state of bliss, but a dynamic center that constantly seeks balance between opposites. Life, seen through the lens of individuation, becomes a spiral, not a straight line. We return to the same themes and complexes repeatedly, but with each turn, we do so from a higher level of consciousness. The work of integrating the shadow, for example, never ends. There will always be new aspects of ourselves that we relegate to the darkness as our consciousness evolves. Similarly, the dialogue with the anima or animus is a continuous dance. The goal is not to solve these archetypes, but to learn to dance with them more consciously and creatively. The individuated individual is not someone without problems. They are someone who has developed the capacity to hold the tension of opposites within themselves without breaking apart. They are someone who can feel love and hate for the same person, who can acknowledge their strength and their vulnerability, their nobility and their pettiness. It is this ability to embrace one's own contradiction that generates the transcendent function, a Jungian term for the emergence of a new attitude, a third way that is not a mere compromise, but a creative synthesis that transcends the original conflict. To live life as a process of individuation means treating everything that happens to us as raw material for the great work. Every crisis, every relationship, every dream, every failure is an opportunity for greater self-knowledge and integration. Life ceases to be a series of random events and becomes a purposeful narrative, a continuous dialogue between the ego and the self. It is a path of increasing authenticity, where we become, more and more, who we truly are, and not who the world or our ego expected us to be. It is a solitary path, for no one can walk our labyrinth for us, but it is one that connects us, on a deeper level, to all of humanity. What is the practical result of a life dedicated to individuation? What is the person who lives in conscious contact with the self like? They do not float 3 feet off the ground or speak in riddles. On the contrary, they are surprisingly ordinary, grounded, and human. The main characteristic is a serene acceptance of reality, both inner and outer. Having confronted and integrated a large part of their shadow, they are no longer reactive and do not need to project their flaws onto others. This makes them less judgmental and more compassionate. Having established a dialogue with their anima or animus, they are capable of genuine relationships, based on the reality of the other, not on their own needs and projections. Having relativized the tyranny of the ego, they are no longer obsessed with success, status, or control. This does not make them passive, on the contrary. It frees them to act in the world from a place of authenticity and purpose, not from neurotic need. They are able to follow their vocation, the call of the self, even if it challenges social conventions. There is a sense of quiet inner authority. Their opinions are not rigid like those of the possessive animus, nor are their feelings chaotic. Like those of the unconscious anima, there is a flexibility and a solidity that come from being rooted in a center that transcends the ego. The individuated person is able to endure suffering without disintegrating, because they know it is part of the totality of life. They are also able to experience joy more fully, as they do not live in constant fear of their shadow. They can laugh at themselves, as their ego is no longer so fragile and inflated. Above all, they live with a sense of purpose that comes not from without, but from within. They feel that their individual life is part of a larger, meaningful pattern. They no longer have the answers, but they have learned to live confidently with the questions, trusting in the guiding wisdom of the self, which manifests through dreams, synchronicity, and intuition. To live from this center is the final paradox. It is by becoming uniquely oneself that the individual best serves the collective. It is the birth of the being who is, at the same time, singular and universal. The drop of water that finally remembers it is the ocean.